Yeah, Bismillah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So today, my topic is it's about Sufism, but a historical approach. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So first, let's start off by defining Sufism. And oftentimes, there's different definitions given for what Sufism or Tasawwuf means, science of the heart, esoteric knowledge, purification of the soul or the nafs or the heart, and Islamic mysticism. The last one being much more common in Western works in academia, that Sufism represents an Islamic form of mysticism, and mysticism being a universal type of religion that's found all over the world at different times. And with all of these definitions, including the definition of Sufism as Islamic mysticism, the focus is on the individual, direct, unmediated relationship with the divine or God. It's usually an authentic religion as opposed to the rule-based or the institutionalized or the legal traditions that are considered to be more profane, worldly. But mysticism is a direct connection usually between a person and the divine or God. And it's usually individual, it's solitary. And so these are the connotations of mysticism. And so the image usually is of a person alone, perhaps in touch with nature, meditating, praying by oneself, removed from society, and in touch with some deeper meanings. And this is how usually Sufism is defined and categorized. Now, I'm not saying that this definition is necessarily wrong, but
or not necessarily right.
Yes, but it's for my purposes in trying to study Sufism as a historical phenomenon, as something that emerged in history, and that's something that developed through actual human beings who lived in this world. This definition isn't very helpful. Historically, I can't study somebody's inward experiences, even when they write about it. So for my purposes, I'm going to be, and so there are also problems with approaching mysticism, Sufism as mysticism. One, it fails to explain or to include a lot of social phenomenon that are associated with Sufism. And so these social phenomena are things like the development of Sufi tariqas, shrines, and the notion of saints. These are all very social phenomena. Moreover, by focusing on mysticism, the focus is usually on Arabic and Persian philosophical and poetical texts, and it ignores so much other literature related to Sufism, such as biographies, hagiographies, which are biographies of saints, genres of called malfuzat, sayings of certain saints that have been recorded, tazkira. So there's a whole lot of other genre out there that are related to Sufis that is ignored when you only focus on mysticism or some type of esoteric knowledge. And so for my purposes of studying Sufism as a historical phenomenon, I'm using this definition, and it's a reworking of definition of a historian named Niall Green, but I've reworded it so it'd be clearer. And basically my functional definition for Sufism today is going to be a powerful Islamic tradition of knowledge, practice, and people aimed at bringing proximity to God. So there's certain parts of the definition that I just want to stress. First of all, that this is a tradition. Sufism as a tradition. And so tradition means that it's rooted in the past. It's rooted in a memory of the past, whether real or imagined. But the past is a big part of a tradition. It's through the past that a Sufi or a wali can legitimate what he is saying. And it authorizes how people can think and behave. It's in relating yourself to the past examples, the past teachings. And in this case, with Sufism, the past refers to the example of the Prophet, whether real or imagined, and people who are believed to have been his successors. Secondly, by focusing it on Sufism as a tradition, it also allows me to highlight the often authoritarian and anti-individual elements that emerged within Sufism historically. Thirdly, by focusing it on tradition, it focuses on historical actors, actual people who created, continued, debated, and changed the tradition. Because this is what happened to traditions in history. And lastly, like I said, traditions emerge in history, they develop, and they change. So this is a historical phenomenon that we can look at. Now, I also mentioned that it's a powerful Islamic tradition of knowledge, practice, and people. And by powerful, I mean that Sufis who were considered saints or awliya, which I will get into, they had three main sources of power. There's a discursive power, and by this I mean there's a shared set of terms, a shared vocabulary that developed, that was used by everyone who claimed to be Sufi, no matter whether they were in Andalus or all the way in Malaysia. Terms that we'll discuss some of them, but things like baraka and awliya and fana and baqa, these terms became ubiquitous. And so by utilizing the term, what you do is that you sort of tap into that tradition. And even if you are being creative in creating a new ritual or a new teaching, these terms allow you to link that to a wider tradition. And that's a source of power and authority. Secondly, a miraculous power. I can't stress this enough, but Sufi saints were actually believed to be able to perform miracles. This was a big source of power. This is why kings and sultans would listen and patronize, give so much funding, was because the idea that the Sufi saints can actually perform miracles. And this is why they had a large following as well amongst rural and what we might call a popular following, was this belief in the ability of Sufi saints to perform miracles. And lastly, economic power. As we'll see, lots of Sufi saints and inheritors of shrines became extremely wealthy, owned lots of land, and their economic power could be leveraged for other gains. So they were extremely important economic agents in history. So yeah, discursive, miraculous, and economic powers. So I've divided following other historians. So I should say from the get-go, all of this is based off of secondary literature, meaning this is my attempt to summarize everything that I had to read about Sufism and Sufi history and religion in English. So none of this is my own original research. This is all secondary literature that I'm presenting. So within the secondary literature, this is a common chronology of Sufism. So from 800 to 1100, origins and foundations of the Sufi tradition. From 1100 to 1400, we're going to see greater organization and institutionalization of Sufism. This is when we'll see things like tariqas develop. From 1400 to 1800, we'll see the way that Sufism becomes appropriated and embedded in large empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and other empires in other parts of the world, but for our purposes, I'll be focusing on the Ottomans and the Mughals. And then the last phase of colonization and modern nation states from 1800 to present day, I probably won't get into too much details about the last phase, just because of constraints of time. So starting off with the first phase, origins and foundations. It used to be suggested that Sufism developed out of asceticism, that initially you had a group, zuhad, a tradition of zuhud, and then from that tradition you got tasawwuf. However, more recent historians see no evidence to make that claim, that they're developed from zuhud to tasawwuf. In actuality, it's more likely that tasawwuf or Sufis were rivals to the earlier zuhud tradition. The earliest mentions that we see of the term Sufi being used to a group of people is in Baghdad in about mid-800s, is in the literature the first times we see them. And this is partially the fact that we don't really have written documents that go before the 800s. But also we don't really have any writing being done that we have still available where people are Sufis, calling themselves Sufis, or calling other people Sufis before about the mid-800s. And especially this develops in Baghdad, a group of Sufis in Baghdad in the 800s. So a few important figures, Al-Muhasibi, the self-reckoner. Importantly, he himself didn't call himself a Sufi, but he quickly became identified by others as a Sufi. So that's just important to distinguish that he himself did not claim to be a Sufi. But nonetheless, he was an important figure in the early tradition. So we have Al-Muhasibi, and he was important because he introduced the notion of taking oneself to account. So a big part of what develops in the Sufi tradition is this focus on the inner self, on interiorization of piety. Besides Al-Muhasibi, we have Al-Kharraz, also in Baghdad, died 899. And we have some of Al-Kharraz's writings, his Kitab al-Sidq, and this is where we see certain terminology. Kitab al-Sidq, a book of sincerity. And this is the first time we see certain terms being used that become really big part of the tradition. Things like a tariqah, a path towards God, where you have maqamat or stations starting with tawbah, and you have, in the end result is wilaya, a type of intimacy. And I'll introduce some of these terms in a bit, but it's important to point out that by the late 800s, these terms were being used in Baghdad by a group of people identifying as Sufis. Of course, the most important and well-known is Junayd al-Baghdadi, who died 910. Now, Junayd is important because a group of Sufis, yeah, it's a misspelling, it's supposed to be Junayd. A group of people really coalesced around him, and he became identified as sort of one of the most important consolidators of Sufi teachings. But he's also important because he was part of the ulama. He was a student of Abu Thawr in his legal methodology, and he was not, and what he shows us, and the reason I wanted to point this out, is that the Sufis in Baghdad were not separate from society. They were part and parcel of the literati. They were engaged in some of the same literary traditions related to what was developing at the time in fiqh and hadith. This is a time in Baghdad. This is right after the Mihna has ended. This is the time when Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Mihna recently had finished. This is one generation removed. The science of hadith and the notion of sahih hadith is taking off. Imam Bukhari passes away about 875. So this is a time in Baghdad when you're still developing a lot of Islamic traditions that we take for granted. The Sahih tradition is still developing as well. And so it's important to keep in mind that the Sufis in Baghdad are writing and teaching and coming up with their teachings at the same time when a lot of the other disciplines have just recently emerged.
Okay, you will talk about Abbasi era.
Right.
almost in all of them.
Yeah.
It was Baghdad.
Yes, this is all happening in Baghdad.
That was for the Abbas.
Right. So this is important to keep in mind that Sufism is developing in dialect and in dialogue with a lot of these other traditions, particularly fiqh and hadith, are developing. That just started developing. And of course, perhaps the most infamous Sufi of this earliest period, Mansur al-Hallaj, who was executed in 922. A lot of earlier historians took this as a sign that there was a hostility between the ulama and the Sufis. However, the execution of Hallaj is an exception, really, and most of the early Sufis were actually quite embedded amongst the ulama. Hallaj representing an exception, and the reason why he was executed, a lot of it has to do with local politics of that time. It's said later on in literature that he claimed to have said, "Ana al-haq," I am the truth. However, these stories only appear a couple centuries later, so they don't actually date to that time. So it's hard to verify if that he actually ever said that, although that really became popular later on.
But his books included this. Tawasin.
It's not clear whether his books can be authenticated to him as well at that time, because he, as far as historians in the Western Academy are concerned. But
You don't have to take their standard for authenticity.
But what he was actually executed for was he was charged with saying that you could make Hajj around a figure that he had built in his house. So that was the legal reason given for the execution at that time. But again, he represents the exception rather than the rule. Now, this is Sufis in Baghdad. Aside from the Sufis in Baghdad, you had other groups emerging that had certain similar views, but they were emerging independently of what was going on in Baghdad. So in Basra, you had Sahlat al-Stari, whose tafsir we still have available. And he had a lot of similar ideas. And I'm going to get into the ideas in a bit. I just wanted to introduce the idea that what might be called, quote unquote, mystical groups, they were actually emerging independently in different parts of the Islamic world. So I talked about Baghdad, that's where you had the Sufis. You had Basra, you had Hakim al-Tirmidhi in what's called Ma Warah al-Nahar, Transoceania, towards Samarkand and Tirmidh. And you had a group called the Malamatiyya in Nishapur, people who believed in blaming their nafs, blaming themselves. The Malamatiyya were a little different, in that all these other groups believed you could erase and annihilate your lower human self, and all that would remain would be your ruh, your spirit. That would be somehow more deeply connected with Allah's attributes. The Malamatiyya didn't believe in erasing the nafs. They believed it could be disciplined. So in that sense, they were a little different. But all these other groups eventually will get swallowed up and all be referred to as Sufis within a century.
Allah, you didn't find anything that started in Al-Arqam? I was really thinking it started in Al-Arqam.
No, so it extends there, but it doesn't start there.
So it's so spread.
And at this time, it's also important to keep in mind, Muslims were still a minority everywhere in the world. Outside of these cities, you didn't have most of Iraq, Iran, Syria, North Africa was still majority non-Muslim at this time in the 900s. And so it's also important to keep in mind that this is developing in cities where you had pockets of Muslims, but overall Muslims were still a minority.
Yeah, but the system was Islamic.
Sure, but in the cities, and there were.
And I would say it's spread there because the Greek philosophy and the Indian philosophy appeared in that region, not in Morocco, not in North Africa.
Perhaps, but it's hard to make a case for foreign origins. So Abu Tariq mentioned that it probably emerged here because of Greek philosophy and contact with Indian philosophy as well. And these theories have been mentioned, but it's really hard to prove historically that there was a one-to-one causation where Greek philosophy caused this, particularly because it doesn't
You can
emerge.
see the roots of the Greek philosophy and the Hindu philosophy in the philosophy in Sufism. Even it reached later on to under.
Well,
You can see this from the Sufis. The Sufis themselves say this.
Later on, yes. But for example, we don't see in areas in Syria and Palestine that had that were very much what's called Hellenized, part of the Greek tradition, as well as North Egypt, Alexandria. These were centers of Greek tradition amongst, because they had been ruled by the Byzantines and stuff. And in these areas, you did have a tradition of the notion that were monks and monasteries could spiritually ascend to God. But Sufism does not develop in these areas. The issue is that if it was clearly a foreign influence, one would have expected in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, when you had strong traditions of Hellenistic Greek culture and ideas about saintly figures like monks spiritually ascending to God, very similar to what the Sufis later on claim. Sufism is not developing in these areas, but rather it's only when the students of Junaid come to Syria and then come to Egypt is the first instances that we see of Sufi ideas coming there. Now, that doesn't mean for sure that foreign influences had nothing to do with it. It just means historically there isn't any evidence at this period to say that foreigners had read literature of foreign religions or philosophy and then taken that and incorporated it. You would need to find actual individuals who were studying philosophy and then writing about Sufism to be able to pinpoint that historically.
Look for material evidence.
Yeah, well, we have
material evidence like in the editing. No, you will not find this.
Well, we do have some later on. Yes.
Something you mentioned actually is a clue that at least there is an influence, not necessarily Sufism is induced purely by these. Maybe there are things in Islam where you want to get close to Allah or the initial cause for trying to do something. But then the influence you mentioned in the East, this tradition that became engulfed by Sufism, which is had something that isn't, where you ignore the needs of the human being. That's maybe Buddhism and Hinduism, the Eastern religions. They do have this notion. It's very much part of their their monk tradition or something.
Right.
So that clearly is something that came, and you said it was engulfed, so maybe it became an influence.
Right. So that's a good question. So he asked, with the Sufi emphasis on ignoring the human conditions, a clear influence of Buddhist or monastic culture. But that was the earlier Zuhud tradition, the idea that you ignore things like working, that you only focus on asceticism and ignore the worldly life. The Sufis criticized that. The Sufis were, these early Sufis were critical of ignoring your worldly life. These early Sufis, especially in Baghdad, but also in Basra, Hakim al-Tirmidhi was a wealthy landowner. The Malamatiyya really were social conformists, that you have to be part of society. These early Sufis were very much embedded in a very elite part of society, as landowners, as educated scholars, as people who were involved in the merchant community. So these were not renunciants who were leaving the world. These people were very much embedded in the society at the time, whether in Baghdad or Basra or in Nishapur. So they were critical of leaving society, of that.
So in 800 or 900, this religion was just part of the Quran.
Yes, it was.
That's probably why.
Yes, so at this point in time, in the first period, it's a very elite phenomenon amongst a specific amount of the literate, of the educated. So it's it's very elite at this moment.
Junaid was also taught by the apostles, I think, that view and didn't show up.
Yeah, well, this is the time when lots of people were being called to the courts and stuff like that. The caliphs were not really in power anymore. But what's also important to mention is, yes. So so this is Baghdad right here. We have the early Sufis and Basra. And then this is Nishapur, where also you have the Malamtis that I mentioned. And then over here is when you got people like Hakim al-Tirmidhi and other people that are called Hakims in this area right here. This is also the area, however, that you have a lot of the major scholars of Hadith emerging from. So these were not, the idea is because they're in the East that somehow they're on the periphery of Islamic society. However, I would urge against that assumption, but rather this area right here became the center of Islamic intellectual activity. And as I proceed, I'll show how that's the case. But this is not considered the periphery. As we'll go on, like Nishapur, a lot of the major Shafi'i scholars come from there. Juwaini, Ghazali, and Hakim al-Saburi, Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, Imam Tirmidhi, the Hadith scholar, Imam Muslim from Nishapur, Imam Bukhari is from Bukhara. So this was, and all the Hanafis eventually emerged in this area as well. So this is not, this part right here is not on the periphery of Islamic society. Beyond the Oxus River, what's called Mawara al-Nahar, or Transoceania, is where you get to the frontier territories. But even there, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were very much Islamized societies. Since Umayyad times, you had troops already there. So this isn't the case where this is like on the periphery. Rather, you can consider Syria and Palestine and this area to be on the periphery. This was the border with the Byzantines, and in 960, the Byzantines reconquered lots of North Syria, and then the Crusaders came in and conquered Palestine in the 1000s for a couple centuries. So this area remained non-Muslim, Syria and Palestine, much longer than Iran did. So it's also just historically important to keep in mind that today we might think of Bukhara, Nishapur, Samarkand as not main centers of Islam. But at this period, it was here that the main centers were. And part of the reason that's the case is because after 800, the Abbasids had a civil war. So Baghdad was the center of all Islamic learning and all Islamic culture. Harun al-Rashid dies. 801 to 806, I believe, there's a civil war. Al-Ma'mun comes on top because he gets the troops from this area. So after Al-Ma'mun's reign, from about 806 onwards, all the major important military commanders and later on will become independent governors are all in this area. So it's from the east that you have, after this period, all the military might, all the people who become rulers, the Buyids will come, the Seljuks will come, the Ottomans will come, the Mahmud Ghaznavi, these all from the east will become the dominant political and military leaders, right? So my whole point is we contextualize that this area is, again, not the periphery, but more and more becomes the central places of Islamic society. So just briefly, because I'm talking more about history, I'm not going to be talking a lot about doctrine, but there are certain concepts that distinguish the Sufis from the broader ulama and the broader literate circles. There was this emphasis on the dichotomy between the nafs and the ruh. Now, the word nafs and the word ruh obviously appears in the Quran, but in Sufi discourse, the juxtaposition, the dichotomy between the nafs and the ruh fighting was a very much part of Sufi discourse. And so it was a stress on harmonizing one's external actions with one's internal intentions. Notions of fana and baqa. So fana, the annihilation of the nafs, and the survival of the ruh,
These three concepts, when did they emerge?
So this all started with Al-Kharraz in Kitab al-Sidq. So Al-Kharraz died 899 in Baghdad. So in his Kitab al-Sidq
Indian philosophy.
is the first times that we see these terms being, that we're aware of these terms being used in this particular way. It very well could be due to foreign philosophy, but that would need to be, more historically shown. The ritualized dhikr, this became part of, so everyone, a lot of the ulama would stress dhikr, but a ritualized, a routinized dhikr was something that was part of Sufi discourse and practice. Sama, it's not clear what sama means in this earliest phase, whether it's music and poetry. However, by the 1000s, it definitely includes music. And words like tariqa, a path towards God, that has certain maqamat or stations that the traveler has to go on. The first maqamat is always tawbah. So to begin your journey towards God, you begin with tawbah. After that, people have different difference of opinion about what the other stations are, but it ends with wilaya. What that means is debated, but it's a type of intimacy with God. For some people, it might denote a type of union where you don't have any human attributes, but you're blended into divine attributes. For some, it just meant a deeper connection. And those who are able to achieve this intimate connection with God are called the awliya. Importantly for the Sufis, now the word awliya is obviously used in the Quran and it has different meanings. For the Sufis, you can't become part of the awliya, you don't become a wali because you work hard. It's something that is chosen by God, and those God chooses are on top of a hierarchy. So from the very beginning, a part of Sufism is a hierarchy. God chooses certain people to be on top of the hierarchy. These people have a very close connection, and they have a knowledge that you cannot gain from just reading the texts, from reading the Quran and the Sunnah. And you can't work on your own to get this knowledge. It's God-given, it's chosen. However, it's also important to point out that at this point, they don't say you can ignore the text. The Sufis were very much, like I said, embedded in scholarly culture. So knowledge of hadith and Quran and tafsir was very much a part of Sufi discourse. But they just believed that this knowledge was not sufficient. And it was only on following the Sufi tariqa, the path towards God, that you truly get a deeper sense of reality. Now, everybody obviously can achieve this if God chooses it. But amongst those who are chosen by God, it becomes their responsibility to still guide everybody else. And of course, everybody writing about this believe that they have been chosen by God. So, so this, the Hakim al-Tirmidhi, who died between 905 and 910, he writes the most. His writings that we still have on the awliya are the most nuanced and detailed, and that's when we really begin to see different levels amongst the awliya, the abdal, and the other levels that are mentioned.
Because also the abdal are hired by God.
Right, right, and
Yes, they say.
and these continue to develop, but the precedent is set during this early period. It's also important, the Malamatiyya that develop in Nishapur, they don't have these theories about wilaya and about the nafs being destroyed. Their emphasis is on controlling and disciplining the nafs, but their discourse doesn't include annihilating it and gaining some type of intimacy with God.
So these levels, or whatever station, whatever they call
Well, these are different groups
all
that,
of them started in 1800.
yeah, between 800 and 900, yes. So all these different groups didn't get absorbed into Sufism.
Once you become a wali, you're no longer praying.
No, you definitely, at this point, you definitely are.
Okay, so they still believe at that time.
Yes, so they were still very much, like I said, embedded in the scholarly culture. So you still had to follow the principles of Sharia. You know, a part of the path, all these people who talk about becoming walis mentioned you can't get there without not just the fard, but you have to do extra nawafil, you have to do extra siyam. This is all a part of the path towards achieving wilaya.
Developed later on, much later on.
Right.
The difference between Sharia, we are no longer asked by Sharia. Not all of them, by the way.
Yeah, this develops later on.
Not all of them serve it.
Okay, so but we've got the basic actors, and we've got the basic concepts that are set by 900. Now, Sufi fusion and beginnings of a tradition. So a tradition isn't just individuals separately talking about similar things. It requires a degree of coherence and a degree of identification that we're all part of something together. So we begin to see that amongst people like Junaid, you have disciples, and they're traveling and they're studying together, and they're traveling to other people and studying together. The students of Sahal al-Tasfari in Basra come to Junaid, then they go to Nishapur, and students of Hakim al-Tirmidhi come and study in Baghdad, or students of Junaid. So you're beginning to see a circle of community of Sufis who are using the same type of language about ruh and nafs and baqa and fana and wilaya emerging. We were able to get a sense of this emerging circle when we look at the biographies of certain muhaddithin. So the most important, this Muhaddith Ibn Khafif al-Shirazi, one of the earliest biographies that we have. So first and foremost, he was a muhaddith. So he was traveling to gain hadith and hear traditions from scholars of hadith. But in his biography, we see that whenever he's meeting scholars of hadith, many of these scholars of hadith are also part of the Sufi tradition. And whenever he's going to travel to hadith, even if the hadith scholar is not a Sufi, in that city, he'll still search out and spend some time with the Sufi. And so from his biography, we get a sense of the degree to which those who identified as Sufis were also part of the network of muhaddithin. And muhaddithin were traveling around because it was important that you actually hear the hadith from your teacher. You can't just read it. And so this, like a Baghdad style Sufism, sort of taps into this network of muhaddithin, and through it, we see a lot of Sufi ideas traveling along with some of these muhaddith/Sufis. In addition, it's really in Nishapur that we see the emergence of Sufism as the beginnings of a tradition. In Nishapur, Sufis and Shafi'is become intertwined. And certain parts of the Sufi tradition begins to emerge. So by this time, you had emerged the Ijaza system in fiqh. So Shafi'i students and the students of their students had started developing a madhab. And a big part of a madhab is that you get an ijazah from your teacher that the book you studied was studied by your teacher, studied by Imam Shafi'i. So you got the ijazah system developing. Alongside this, you have what's called the Sahih tradition becoming full-fledged. The Sahih tradition meaning the importance of Sahih isnads in hadith. So like I said, Imam Bukhari died in 875, but it wasn't until about 1.5 centuries that his book became unanimous, widely accepted, especially amongst the Shafi'is. So Sufism starts to develop a master-disciple, sheikh, murid type of institution around the same time when amongst the fuqaha, the ijazah system has just emerged. Amongst the muhaddithin, the isnad system has just emerged. And it's in Nishapur where you have muhaddithin and Shafi'is really in control that Sufism becomes a big part of the Shafi'i madhab. And this is where we first see the master-disciple relationship, the sheikh-murid relationship. So what this means is that before, you had Sufis that would seek out informal companionships with teachers, and then they might travel and go somewhere else and learn from somewhere else. But now in Nishapur, starting in the 900s, you see more and more that the teacher requires a Sufi student to give a pledge, to give bay'ah, and you only stick with that one teacher for your life. And you get literature emerging stressing the importance of obeying every single thing that the Sufi sheikh says. This begins in the 900s, and it starts to develop thereafter. In addition to that, to the fusion of Sufism with the Shafi'i madhab, you get a more self-conscious tradition. The idea in the late 900s and 1000s that those who are Sufis are part of something with a larger history. So you see, beginning with Sulami, who writes, he's a Shafi'i hadith scholar in Nishapur, writes Tabaqat al-Sufiya, the generations of Sufis, giving a history to Sufis. Importantly, the Malamati figures are counted amongst the Sufis. So a lot of the stress on things like tazkiyatun nafs, on purification of the soul, a lot of the Sufi talk that isn't about a union with God, or isn't about wilaya or fana or baqa. So a lot of these are the remnants of that old Malamati tradition that focus on discipline, not so much on union with God. You get As-Sarraj, also Nishapur, writes Kitab al-Luma' fi Tasawwuf, and he states that the Sufis are the true heirs of the prophets. The true warathatul anbiya are the Sufis. As-Sarraj himself was also an important scholar, but he was not himself a famous Sufi. But nonetheless, his book gave a lot of emphasis on the importance of the Sufis. In Trans-Oceania, so Al-Kalabadi writes a book, Ta'arruf al-Madhab Ahl Tasawwuf. So the title indicates by this time you have something called the Madhab of Ahl Tasawwuf, the emergence of a particular tradition. Al-Kalabadi himself was not a Sufi. If anything, he's most likely associated with the Hakims. He was a Hanafi, but he's introducing Sufism for a non-Sufi audience in Samarkand and that part of the world. Abu Talib al-Makki from Nishapur as well, writing in his book, we begin to see that distinction between proper Sufism and improper Sufism. That debates about what is true Sufism, what isn't true Sufism. People claiming that they can be one with God and leave a lot of the fara'id are considered wrong Sufis. They're not true Sufis. So, by the fact that they're debating now what's a true Sufi or not a true Sufi, it indicates that you had people now claiming to be Sufis who believe that they could leave things like prayer, or they could behave against aspects of the Sharia. And so Abu Talib al-Makki is saying those are not true Sufis, even if they claim to be. So we see the emergence of this inner Sufi debate. Abu Nu'aym al-Asfahani died 1038. He writes a book of history, Hilyat al-Awliya. This book is important because it connects the Sufis of his time as being inheriting their tradition from previous awliya. And who are the previous awliya? Imam Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Hassan al-Basri, and all the Tabi'een. And so by this time you see that Abu Nu'aym al-Asfahani himself was a hadith scholar, but what it shows is that the Sufis themselves regarded themselves as being connected to not just fuqaha like Shafi'i, Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but also to previous Tabi'een like Hassan al-Basri.
At this time, this person and the people who are trying to link themselves to the ulama, are they behaving in a way where there is a hierarchy in the Sufi tradition they believe in also?
Yeah, so the question asking if these authors are also behaving as if they're part of a hierarchy in the Sufi tradition. Many of these authors themselves didn't consider themselves to be awliya. However, people like, in some of these authors, you do see the recognition that there does exist a hierarchy of Sufis. As-Sulami, Sarraj, Abu Nu'aym al-Asfahani, they themselves didn't consider themselves to be part of the awliya, but there is indication that they did believe in the idea that there are hierarchies of awliya.
This is important, even those who do not believe in things that bring you out of the deen, obviously, because this is basically the development of a cult within the deen, and this is, it has to be studied carefully. Are they trying to link themselves to the ulama because that gives their movement a legitimacy, or were there some influences of those ulama where they were belonging to something that is broader Sufism, but there is an evolution and there is branching. So, I mean, there is a lot there to look at.
Right. So the question you're talking about, if these scholars are introducing like a cult to legitimize themselves, it's important that these people were all ulama. So they don't consider themselves awliya because they're not famous for being Sufis. They're famous for either being Shafi'i teachers or scholars of hadith. So these people they didn't need justification for themselves because they were already part of the scholarly circles. They were teaching Shafi'i fiqh, they were teaching hadith, but they also felt themselves tied to a Sufi tradition, and they were writing about that to show how there's no conflict between their role as a Shafi'i faqih or a muhaddith and tasawwuf. But like these were all what we might call establishment scholars. These were not controversial scholars at that time. Like Al-Qushayri, he was, like the leaders of the Shafi'is initially. So these are not people who were marginal. They were establishment, so the scholars. The last person here, Al-Hujri, who wrote Kashf al-Mahjub. For the first time in late 1000s, you see a scholar writing in Persian. And I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of vernacular languages. Hujri died in Lahore, and his shrine is still famous in Lahore. So we see a more eastward shift.
It's interesting, during the same time between 900 to 1000, Shia had a state in Iran and Iraq.
Yeah, so I'll mention that.
That's interesting, the timing when the Sufi came out. And the Shia has a lot of self, blaming and you are the victims and blah, 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 and hurt yourself, to elevate yourself, connect with saying on Allah. Very interested to see how that correlates the system.
Right. So the question asking about this is during the time that the Buwayhids, Shia dynasty, were ruling in Iraq and Iran. I'm going to come to that, how that's relevant. It's not quite relevant in the way you mentioned, but it is relevant. And it's relevant, I'll just answer right now. So, yes. So these were the important Muslim dynasties that at different points in time became powerful in Iran and Iraq, in Syria and in Egypt as well. The Buwayhids were, like the brother mentioned, Shias. And 935, they took control of Baghdad. It's a group of three brothers. One brother was able to control Baghdad, other two brothers in Marw and in another city in Iran. And so together, they became the de facto rulers in Iran and Iraq. They didn't get rid of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was more convenient for them to keep the Abbasid Caliph and use it to legitimize themselves. They took titles like Imad al-Dawla, Rukn al-Dawla, the support of the Abbasid Caliphate, the pillar of the Caliphate. But this was a very decentralized rule. So they didn't have strong control. Especially in Baghdad, they had a very little control at times. And the different Buwayhid sultans were also rivals to one another. And what this allowed this decentralized nature allowed Muslims institutions to develop from among the landed classes, the ulama, the patricians, rather than sort of a top-down effort. The Buyid era is marked by very little government control and people who own land and patricians becoming much more influential. So it's during this time in Nishapur when you get the emergence of the madrasa, of what's called the Sufi lodges, and also khanqahs. So the madrasa develops during the Buyid rule, firstly in Nishapur, and then the khanqah also develops in this area. And after the Buyids are defeated by the Seljuks, when the Seljuks are a Turkish, they're part of the Oghuz tribal coalition. They came from Central Asia. That's a wider history about how disturbances towards the east pushed a lot of Turkish tribes westward. Some of them converted. The Seljuks being one group of Turkish that converted, they moved westward. They defeated the Buyids. As recent converts, they tried to legitimize themselves as Sunni rulers. And what they took to be Sunni Islam were the institutions of the madrasa and the khanqah. And so during Seljuk rule, we see the proliferation in Iran and Iraq of both the madrasa and the khanqah. And so Seljuk rule is marked by a spread of Sufi institutions. The madrasa is also important to remember as a Sufi institution because a lot of the prominent teachers at madrasas were self-identified Sufis. The most famous teacher of what's called the Nizamiya colleges, Nizamiya madrasa, was Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, who died 1111. He himself was also a famous Sufi. A generation later, Abu Najib as-Suhrawardi, also a teacher in the Nizamiya colleges of Shafi'i fiqh and hadith, and also a self-avowed Sufi. So the madrasas were important conduits for the spread of Sufi ideas, not because they were teaching Sufi texts, but because the people who were teaching Shafi'i texts, fiqh texts, hadith texts also happened to be Sufis. In addition to the madrasa, you had what I'm calling Sufi lodges. These were things like for travelers or for things like soup kitchens for the poor, to feed the poor, established by certain Sufis, the most famous being Abu Ishaq al-Khazaruni, who died 1035. He's famous because he was very much involved in preaching to Zoroastrians. He was building masjids in places that were still predominantly Zoroastrian. He was persecuted as well by Zoroastrian landed elite, but was able to get help from the ruling sultans to establish his masjids. So he played a big role in the. He lived at the time when you had the last remaining Zoroastrians were becoming Muslim. So it's in the 1000s that Iraq and Iran becomes majority Muslim. So he's living at a time when you've got the last remaining pockets of influential Zoroastrians still existing. And so Khazaruni played a big role in spreading Islam to these last few remaining pockets of Zoroastrianism in Iran. But he did more than that. He also built lodges for travelers. And then his followers continued that. And they built lodges that extended from Iran all the way to the ports in China. And what that did was, it was very convenient for merchants. And so you had more merchants being introduced to sort of Muslims' way of life, but also more merchants now donating to Sufi institutions, which created an independent source of wealth connected to merchant trade that extended from Iran to China. Aside from the Sufi lodges, which were sort of independently built, you had khanqahs, which were built by, patronized by rulings, by the sultans, especially by the Seljuks, because like I said, the khanqah had become a Sunni Muslim institution, and if you want to prove your Sunni identity, if you want to play the Sunni card, you build madrasas and you build khanqahs, and the Seljuks did that.
What is Arabic khanqah?
Yeah, so the reason why it's called a khanqa is because it developed in the Persian-speaking world. So you had institutions like zawiyas or ribat that were used in the Arabic-speaking world, but they were still slightly different than khanqas. Khanqas are basically lodges for Sufis. Sufis can come, study, teach, meditate, do their rituals, whatever they believe in these lodges. It was separate.
Like halakha?
Yeah, so you can have Sufi halaqas. They would happen from this point on, from 1000s, in khanqas. So this was a particular institution for the teaching of Sufi texts, for the performance of Sufi dhikr, for people to come do meditation or khalwat, sort of seclusion from other parts of the world. And it's important because before this period, before the 1000s, all the Sufis were either connected to merchants, they owned land, or they themselves were scholars and teachers to get money. With the institution of the khanqas, now you get Sufis who don't need to work, and they're funded by the government. And so this was a big shift in terms of the wealth for the Sufis. It's also, yeah. Yes, right. So this is also the period, so one of the first builders of khanqas was a person by the name of Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Khair. And so he was the first one that started writing their rules to khanqa, so standardizing sort of Sufi practice, but also the introduction of music performances as part of broader Sufi practice. Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Khair was criticized by al-Qushayri and by the Nishapuri Shafi'i Sufis. They were very critical of a lot of the stuff that Ibn Khair was doing. But a lot of his practices would later on spread to other Sufi institutions. So that's why I had that. This is the time when 1000s. When
Are you going to later talk about why the Shah allowed such a spread?
Right. So if you see, by this time the Khalifa had no power. He was basically a puppet of the Buyids or the Shia, then of the Seljuks, then of the Ayyubids, and then of the Mamluks for a short time before the Mongols came and destroyed it all. So this is a time when you don't have stable political powers, but you do have stable Sufi organizations. The people who own land, the people who run institutions, these families and their descendants are what's stable. The political rulers are coming and going. So this is another aspect of why historically Sufism became so embedded in sort of Sunni Islamic culture, is because they were there when the politics was changing. Especially because both the Buyids and the Seljuks were quite decentralized. It was not like one ruler ruling everything very closely. It was brothers, cousins, sort of very decentralized. And for most people, if you needed things done, you go to important landowners who were influential, which happened to be oftentimes Sufis. And as the Seljuks were trying to show their Sunni Islamness, and they were patronizing more and more Sufis, more land was being given over to Sufi leaders as waqf. Sufi families were becoming more and more prominent and important. So they became the staple of society, a sign of stability, when during this time you see so many different rulers changing. Yeah.
And also by this time, the Sufi states had a lot of followers went from Khawas.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about, I'll be talking about this, yes. So he's talking about the importance of Sufi saints becoming more common. Yes, I'm going to be talking about that. What was important to also point out before I move on is during the Ayyubids, Salahuddin Ayyubi conquers the Fatimids in Egypt. Fatimids were a Shia dynasty that had been ruling Egypt since 965. And he also conquers the Crusader states that were in Palestine. He enters Jerusalem in 1181. So these were areas in northern Syria, Palestine, and Egypt that had not been ruled by Sunnis for a few centuries now. And when Salahuddin comes finally, in the late 1100s, conquered Egypt, conquered Syria, conquered Palestine from the Crusaders. One of his goals is to sort of spiritually colonize these areas that had been Shia or Christian. And a big part of that was building madrasas and building khanqahs. So when he enters Jerusalem in 1181, one of the first things he does is he builds the Salihiyya khanqah and the madrasa. And he spreads khanqahs all throughout Egypt as well. And importantly, the influence of the Sufis as miracle workers became really important here. So Salah ad-Din, before he engaged in battle, always requested the blessings of Sufi sheikh. And as he gained victory after victory, defeating the Fatimids, defeating the Crusaders, it gave more power to the Sufis. If it worked for Salah ad-Din, it would work for everybody. For the first time, we have a group that defeated the Crusaders. So, and we still have waqf documents for the khanqahs he built in Palestine. And in the waqf documents, it states that the Sufis in the khanqahs twice a week publicly had to send blessings on Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. So this was part propaganda, but also part reality. There was this belief that to have success, you needed the blessings of the Sufi sheikhs. What?
Similar to the Tuqiyya, the Shia.
In a sense, yes. But at this point, it's because these people are religious and pious, and they have a deep connection with God. So if they make dua for blessings, then it makes sense that God will listen to them. And so that became a very powerful factor in politics, the blessings of the Sufis. Yes.
So actually, Salah ad-Din got the assistance of Al-Ghazali in utilizing the Sufi network in his work. And Al-Ghazali played a great role in education and in reforming people intellectually. Now, that's why we say, and it's not all Sufis are the same in the same package. So they are not giving their barakah to Salah ad-Din because out of fear. They were part of his work.
Right, so I was making the point that Imam Ghazali played a big role in supporting Salah ad-Din through educational activities, and also the Sufis were not supporting Salah ad-Din out of fear, but because they were a part of his success. That's true. When the Sufis who were supposed to give blessings on Salah ad-Din twice a week in public, it wasn't out of fear.
Not Tuqiyya, I mean.
Yeah, it wasn't Tuqiyya, it wasn't out of fear. The relationship between, we'll see at this point, it'll shift, and a lot of times it'll be the rulers who might be in fear of the Sufis, because again, the power of their blessings, their barakah, their dua, it was a reality for a lot of people, and to resolve the fear, if you get on their bad side politically, it could be damaging. So it wasn't like a one-way thing where you could force Sufis to make dua for you.
You talk about the ijazah, was the time the ijazah process started. My recollection that the ijazah started when Azhar was established, wasn't it? Or before that?
No, it was a part of the question about when the ijazah started. No, so whether the question about if the ijazah started when Azhar was established, because I said it started earlier. It became a big part of the madhab started developing. That the way the madhab developed was that you had texts written by earlier scholars like Imam Shafi'i, his Kitab al-Umm, his Risala, and then his students studied it, and then his students studied it. And so it became a process where you're connected to the Shafi'i madhab because you've learned the texts from teachers who have learned it eventually from Imam Shafi'i. Right? So that's how it was important. And the similar idea carried on to the Sufi tradition, that you have silsilas that connect you to previous teachers. Yes, a question.
Keep mentioning Ramadan. What is it? Is it a special treat or is it character information?
Yes, so the question about what are khanqahs, because I keep mentioning them. Khanqahs were specific institutions that were set aside for Sufis. It would be for Sufi rituals, for Sufi studies, for Sufi dhikr. There'd be places where Sufis who were traveling could spend the night or could stay there. So it was different from masjids or madrasas.
Khan, I think the word Khan
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know the exact etymology. Yeah, it is, because it started off in Persia. But what's important is that you had similar institutions like the Zawiya and the Ribat, but usually Zawiyas and the Ribat were not established by governments. They were usually established by individuals. They might receive government funding later on, but Khaniqahs were established by ruling authorities for Sufi activities and Sufi learning.
What I did, spiritual retreat or just reform my character, or as reform my character?
So as you'll see, that as different Sufi methods and tariqas developed, the Khaniqahs had very different functions. So in some Khaniqahs, you might have singing and music and people listening, whereas in some Khaniqahs, it might be just silent dhikr. Yeah, so it really depended. Yes. When they started what? Yeah, so he's asking a question about when did the Sufis start to get buried in Khaniqahs. This also started starting in the 1100s, and I'll get to that. The shrines became a big part of what Sufism is.
You know, in India, Khaniqahs all over nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah, they still exist. You know, Faisal comes here at night. His family ran a Khaniqah, still does. So now they take care of orphanage, teaching of Islam in general, and whatever the community needs, they go to the Khaniqah.
Right, and so actually that's an excellent point. So attached to Khaniqahs often were things like soup kitchens, things where part of the Sufi training was that you cook food and serve the poor, and sort of thing, and orphanages. So this was a part of the Khaniqah establishment often. Right. So in the Seljuk, and especially in the Ayyubid period, the ruler would pick the head Sufi for the Khanqahs. It would be under the state control. And in the Waqf documents, it would state that the Salahuddin or his descendants get to pick, and then the Mamluks inherited that, and so the Sultan gets to pick who would be the head Sufi for the Khanqahs. Yeah, so it did start to include instruments. Yeah, so and in turn, Khaniqahs, music did become a part of Sufi practice, and music instruments were used. This was obviously a very debated issue. Certain Sufis were very much against it. Certain Sufis believed that it was integral to use music for the Sufi path towards intimacy with God. But in Khaniqah, especially in the Chistiya in India, and the Mevleviya, that the musical instruments were part of the Khanqahs.
One should differentiate that music is not good music or something like that. It's more to music, devotional towards God or something.
Yes, it is devotional music. So there were musical instruments as well, but the words and the lyrics were devotional music. However, a big part of their popularity was the fact that it was fun to listen to. And so what we do see is that as Sufism shifts from an elite religion to a more that included both elite and popular, the quote unquote fun aspect of the qawalis and stuff was a part of it. And it was acknowledged by the Sufis. The idea was if they come, it's still beneficial. Even if they're just coming for fun. So that did develop. Let me just continue because I'm running out of time. So I just want to, a lot of the stuff is coming in this. So the second period is a period of greater organization and institutionalization from 1100 to 1400. So this is where we see the development of tariqas, of specific silsilas, of specific smaller sub-traditions within the larger tradition of Sufism based on the Sheikh-Murid relationship. The master-disciple, the Sufi master is in charge of one's guidance. And he's related he's linked to previous Sufi masters that are linked eventually to the Prophet. During this period is when we also see the shift from the Sufi master to a Sufi saint. And I'll get into what I mean by that. And importantly, we see the vernacularization of Sufism for 11th century, that you don't have to be Arabic speaking to be part of the Sufi tradition. So the master-disciple relationship, like I mentioned, it was more formal. You have various institutions that become centers for giving your pledge to a Sufi master. So I mentioned khanaqahs established by governments, but you had things like ribats and zawiyas, which are usually established by individuals. They might get government funding later, but they were not formed by the governments. And in South Asia, we also have things called taqiyas. But basically, they're all institutions headed by a Sufi master for training of his disciples. I like to, when I think of master-disciple relationship, I usually think of Star Wars. Think of like Yoda training Luke Skywalker. You know, it's not just this physical training, there's also sort of meditative training, having control of your thoughts, in that type of relationship. And obviously there's also a silsila with the Jedi masters, similar to with the Sufis. And eventually the Padawan Jedi becomes a Jedi master. Similarly, the Sufi murid, when he's able to complete his training, becomes himself a Sufi sheikh who can take on his own disciples. This is also time we see a standardization of training texts and rituals. So before this period, you know, each Sufi sheikh might come up with his own lessons, his own disciplining regimes. At this time, you see a standardization. One sheikh writes a text, that becomes the text of that community generation after generation. So we see this, these are some of the dates given for the founders of some of the Sufi tariqas. What's important to point out with Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, who died in 1166, this is an area that still is in need of a lot of research because it's not clear how he became the head of a Sufi tariqa. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani was a famous preacher, a public preacher in Baghdad, associated with the Hanbali madhab. We have remainings of his khutbahs. He didn't really leave any written words, but he left his khutbahs that were compiled. And they have almost nothing to do with the Qadri silsila that develops. And so it's not clear how he became considered the head of the Qadri tariqa that developed in his name, and how he became like Ghawth Adam, the most important Sufi saint. A lot of his khutbahs are pure tawheed, only worshiping Allah. When I was in India, one of my teachers used to read from his khutbahs and his personal lessons, and used to be very critical of what became of his legacy by the tariqa. It hasn't really received any serious study, how you went from Abdul Qadir Jilani to the strict Hanbali preacher to the Qadri tariqa, which doesn't really resemble his teachings. Yeah.
What I read before, the ribat is linked together, and zawiyas, I think they used to make prayers right there. And Taqiyyah was the idle people, just they come to eat and sleep and everything. They were not even working, they were so lazy. So why they call it Taqiyyah? So then elaborate on this one.
There's a question about the terminologies of khanaqah, ribat, zawiyas, taqiyyahs. They're all used similarly because they're all referred to places where Sufi mashayikh can give their training. I know in South Asia, taqiyyahs are still used as like Sufi lodges, similar to zawiyas. It's not a big difference in the meaning. So that's these are the terms that are used for a place. Oh, so usually they get what's called endowments. Yes, wealth. So like a certain amount of land is now in charge of the Sufis, and they live off of that revenue. So these become centers of lots of wealth. So yeah, you have the development of these various different Sufi tariqas. They weren't actually founded by these figures. It was later on, usually followers who founded the tariqah and then would ascribe it to these early figures. Okay, so from Sufi masters to Sufi saints. So we had already the notion of awliya as friends of God. And we had mentioned how there was a hierarchy already, and they were considered important conduits of barakah, of a source of the Prophet Muhammad's grace. And importantly, with Ibn Arabi, there's his writings on sainthood change things. And he says that sainthood is actually a higher station than prophethood. And so this adds even more importance to what it means to be a wali. Not only that, but he further develops the idea of the access, and that the world is basically controlled by the awliya. And of course, he considers himself, the Khatm al-Awliya, the most important, the seal of the saints. So what's important for our purposes is the idea that now the wali, the saint of God, the wali of Allah, the friend of Allah, is not something that's limited to an elite circle of scholars who are discussing this theoretically, but the idea spreads more broadly. The idea that anyone can access the Prophet's barakah by going to a Sufi wali becomes more prominent during this period from 1100 to 400. Yeah.
Addressing the Jews. So how much of this concept of being special and better than other people, you have a hierarchy, how much of that we know that we're talking about creeds for Christianity and different quarters, but this is exactly what is Allah is referring to the Jews.
Yeah, so the question asking about this verse in the Quran that talks addressing the Jews about being awliya, and how much of the Sufi discourse on awliya is coming from the Jews. I can't really say how much. However, it's a good question in the sense that, so like I said, this was the period when you had Sunni Muslim control over Syria and Palestine for the first time in centuries. And Syria already had a very long legacy of notions of holy men and their shrines. And Muslims were already participating in the shrine culture of the Christians and Jews. John the Baptist's head was believed to have been in the Umayyad Mosque from the very beginning, but also Ibrahim al-Islam and some of his children, other biblical prophets that had already had shrines in Palestine that were run by Christians and Jews, had already become sources or places where Muslims were going for ziyarah, pilgrimage, and the idea that these people, the remains of these prophets supposedly were connected to Allah, and so they were sources of barakah as well, was already a part of the culture. You didn't have Muslim shrines until after the reconquest of Syria by Salah ad-Din. So it's only after 1200 that you begin to see for the first time distinctly Muslim shrines emerging in Syria and Palestine. Not before that. You already had shrine practices, but it wasn't until 1200s where you get specifically the shrines of Muslim awliya. This emerges during this time.
The question I had was like, when they consider themselves better, they think that they are better than regular people. That's what I'm trying to make the similarity.
Yeah, so he's asking, they consider themselves better in the verse, so how much of that is influencing the Muslim Sufis. I don't know how much it's influencing people like Ibn Arabi who are writing about this, but it is definitely influencing commoners. Like the idea that you have saints that are better and more connected already exists. And so when you already have the Sufi discourse of awliya, it sort of maps on top of this already existent culture of saints. So amongst the commoners, the lay people, they already had this tradition, and now it's just a shift from, okay, we already had these shrines, now we have more. And so for them, it's definitely an influence. Now, how much is it for like the writers, like Ibn Arabi? It'd be hard for me to say. I'd have to look more closely at the writings, which I haven't done. But it's definitely a part of the culture already. And so it's very acceptable for people, the idea of saints. And this is also the time, it's important to keep in mind that from 1200 to 1400 is when most of Syria and Palestine becomes Muslim. Because this area had been reconquered by the Byzantine army in 960 and the Crusaders until 1181, you had a very strong Christian presence in Palestine and northern Syria. From 1200 to 1400 is when you first see the move to majority Muslim areas in this part of Palestine and Syria. So what that also means is that a lot of these people who are now becoming Muslim are coming from traditions where the saintly culture was already very prominent. And the emergence of shrines is actually not, it wasn't an effect of conversion. It's actually been shown that first you got Muslim shrines start to appear in the 1200s, and then you start to see conversion happening. So the shrines were linked to the cause of conversion. It's not studied as well of how the exact process happened, like how Muslim shrines led to conversion. But this process is better known in South Asia and in India, and so I'm going to be getting to that as well. But the shrines were important because the physical structure lead to multiple sacred sites that dot the globe. So most people can't ever go to make Hajj and ziyarah to Masjid Nabawi. But most people can go to the local saint and shrine and connect to the Prophet's barakah by going to that shrine. In a society which is majority illiterate, the only connection most of the people in the world had to Islam was through individuals and people who had died. It wasn't through a text, it wasn't through the Quran per se, it was through the local wali and the shrine. And so if you hadn't, this is when we see when people have problems, personal problems, marital problems, health problems, you go to the local wali and you make dua. Whether he's living or the dead or the descendants, this becomes a very powerful pull for people. Not just for commoners, but we also saw for royalty and for elite. Miracles. Miracle stories spread. Miracle stories were very popular. Ibn Taymiyyah talks about how much he's exasperated by people spreading these miracle stories that are clearly false. Not that he didn't believe in himself, but he was very critical of these crazy miracle stories because people believed them. And a big part of that was hagiographical writing, writing about the biographies of saints. This connected a memory of the saint in written form, and it was read and reread and reread, and it reinforced the notion that this saint buried here could do all these miracles. And these hagiographic writings were read out loud. They were part of the Sufi culture, and so it really added to the power of the Sufi saints, dead or alive. And it was also in the interest, if I'm a descendant of a famous Sufi sheikh, it's my interest to make sure that he is seen as being better than the other ones, because then that makes me better as his inheritor. And so this is also, we see now competition amongst the hagiographical writing, that my sheikh is better than that sheikh, and as the descendants and as the murid, I'm better than the other murids. We see this proliferating at this time. Yes?
At this point, defeats the very purpose of Sufism.
Well, some would say that, yes.
When we said we have to control the inner self, suppress the ego, and at the very beginning, the first feels right. This goes against that.
Yeah, so Abdullah is saying that this competition goes against that, the essence of Sufism. Yes, And the way that people engaging in this activity would reply is that it's for the benefit of the people that they come here to our tradition and not to the other one. So but yes, yeah.
Why is presentation? Are you super fancy for special portion?
This is
why pick up this one? What's the end result of it?
It was just I was presenting on something that I had already done research on for my exams, and so it was just to understand the history of this. Because usually when we study Sufism, we study either doctrine or theology, how it's wrong or where it came from. But it's also important to understand why it was so popular, like historically. It's not necessarily related to it being right or wrong. It has to do with the function of human history. So whether like ideas become prominent now or they become marginal, it's not necessarily because the idea in and of itself is right or wrong, but historical factors that really determine, what is popular and what isn't. And then we mentioned pilgrimages as well. So the vernacularization, this is the best map I could find, but basically all the different colors represent different languages that were being spoken by Muslims. So there's multiple different colors represented, even if you can't read what each one of them are. Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, Malay, Indonesian, Swahili, Hausa, Bengali. These were all local vernacular languages, and the Sufi tradition became expressed in all of these languages. So whereas a lot of the scholarly output of the ulama, no matter where in the world they usually were writing in Arabic and for one another. The Sufi tradition becomes written for everybody by using vernacular languages, by using languages that local people understand. But not just using local languages, using local folklore, local stories, local sayings, very much embedded in local culture. And through this mechanism, Sufi ideas about sainthood and about everything else related to it becomes part and parcel of the religion of Muslims in all these local areas. So for them, and for most of these Muslims, Sufism is Islam. This is what they experience as Islam. And so Sufism and Islamization. So there hasn't been as much work in Syria, although I did mention that how the emergence of Sufi shrines precipitates mass conversion in Syria. This has been better studied in India. So in Punjab, a part of northern India, in the late 1200s, a Sufi from the Chishti order by the name of Baba Farid Gan Shakar came in Punjab. He came to a town that was already a Muslim town, a masjid there, and he built his own Sufi lodge. He used vernacular Punjabi language to express a lot of his teachings. And then when he passed away, his sons and grandsons inherited the shrine. And over time, the local Muslim rulers, initially the Delhi Sultanates, and then the Mughals, started heavily patronizing the shrine of Baba Farid. So what that meant was they would give them land in that area, that these lands would be your land for revenues, but importantly, not just as wealth, but these lands would be yours to sort of govern, and then part of the taxes that you get from this, you would give to the central government. So in this sense, the shrine of Baba Farid became an arm of the government. Because again, it's not like you have a central government where you can go to every village and collect taxes. So things like this were subcontracted out, and the shrine of Baba Farid over generations became an important part of collecting taxes for the government in rural areas. Importantly, farming for agriculture would be untaxed. And in this time in Punjab, you had a lot of nomadic groups that were not necessarily Hindu. They weren't part of the Hindu Brahmin culture, but they were not Muslim. And so the guardians, the inheritors of Baba Farid's shrine really encouraged all these nomadic groups like the Jat, Arai, Khokar, all these Punjabi names, they were initially nomads, and it's through the descendants of Baba Farid, they were encouraged to become peasant agriculturalists, to start farming instead of being nomadic. Through farming, they became much more closely aligned with the shrine of Baba Farid, because these were the people that were collecting taxes and arranging things like qawwali and being part of the poetry tradition. And all these Punjabi groups eventually became pulled toward the shrine, and we have over generations mass conversion to the point where all these areas now in Punjab is predominantly Muslim. So now we see how it's not that the Sufis themselves are preachers, which is actually not true, but sociologically, because of the influence of the shrine culture on non-literate peoples, it drew people into Islam. Initially, Islam was just going to the shrine. So whether it included things like prayer and fasting, it's hard to say, but eventually what you get is reform movements that try to get people to believe in correct Islam, a long multi-generational process. What's important to stress is that it's the Sufi shrine as like the local center of gravity almost, that attracts locals and eventually brings them part of Muslim culture, if not Islam. And a similar process happened in other parts of India as well. And it can be surmised that similar things happen in Syria.
Did the shrine happen or started after the death of Salah?
Yes.
Syria.
Yes, in Syria, yes.
They were not allowed.
And the interesting thing is all these local tribes in Punjab have their stories that Baba Farid himself converted their tribes, but it was really the shrine itself. So the legacy of the shrine carries on. But it's important to notice that historically, for all these groups that become Muslim, especially in South Asia, Central Asia, we'll see in parts of Syria, North Africa, it's the relationship to shrines and Sufi saints that is how they encounter Islam. And then it's a process of generations later of reformist movements that try to realign towards quote-unquote orthodox or correct belief. But it's still important to realize the function of shrines historically. So this is the next stage, Sufism and empires. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend too much. But basically, you get Sufi warriors. So you have, like I mentioned, all these tribal groups that are coming, the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, Turks. Because these are tribal groups, they don't trust one another, but they'll trust an outsider. So Sufi sheikhs become commanders of large tribal groups. This is how the Ottomans gain power, is through the use, through the help of these Sufi leaders who are in charge of tribal groups that are doing what's called the Ghazwa warfare along the Byzantine frontier. Same thing with the Mughals. They have Sufi saints who are warriors that lead the way initially. These Sufis, tariqas become incorporated into the Ottoman and Mughal empires. The Ottoman Empire had a very detailed registry of every single Sufi lodge, who were the heads of the lodge. The Ottomans would pick who should be the heads. The Sufi lodges were a big part in how they would collect taxes, but also whenever they would conquer new areas, such as Christian areas, they would build Sufi lodges as a part of sort of spiritual colonization, in a sense. You get people to come. If there's Sufi lodges there, merchants come. And so you get Sufi tariqas importantly become incorporated into the Ottoman and Mughal empires. Now what happens then is that when the Ottoman and Mughal empires decline, the fortunes of the Sufi tariqas decline as well. And so a big part in the modern period, although you still have Sufis, they're not nearly as powerful to a certain extent, is because the basis of the power had become so aligned with the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire that with the collapse of the empires, you see a very much weakening of the Sufi lodges and Sufi sheikhs. This period is also when we see critiques, for the first time major critiques of parts of Sufism. And again, why is it during this time from 1600 to 1800 that we see like major critiques? So we had critiques before, like Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, in the 1300s. But these were limited to certain practices. But from 1600 to 1800, everywhere where there's Sufism, emerge critiques of Sufism. So you get a global phenomenon. This is still understudied because whenever you have something that's happening everywhere in the globe, there's usually some related thing going on. It's not usually coincidence. Part of the reason probably has to do with the fact that 1591 was the turn of the Hijri millennium. And so this was a big part of a lot of people's consciousness, that there's a need for renewal, a need for reform, because it's the new millennium for Islam. But also increasing, it's important to point out that this is a period of early modernity. This is when you had increasing contact between regions of the world, that more contact than before. You had increasing urbanization, so you had more peasants moving from rural places to urban places, and they would bring with them their old ideas and practices that would get critiqued by the urban scholars. But you also had, at this time, increased presence of royal government officials in rural areas, as they were getting more and more control of rural areas. So you have more people now encountering rural forms, popular forms of Sufism that become increasingly critiqued. It's also important to keep in mind that this is the same period in Europe when you have a discourse on witchcraft. By that I mean criticisms of superstition and witchcraft, same time in Europe. So to a certain degree, there's a global process going on where there's more urbanization, more increased understanding of other parts of the world. I think there's also something, a lot of the critics of Sufism were studying in Mecca and Medina in hadith circles. And this is understudied, but the effect of this hadith circle on the people from Africa, from South Asia, from different parts would come, and somehow people with contact with Mecca and Medina during this time would carry back ideas that were very critical of ideas of bid'ah and stuff. So that's still understudied. Just a few important critics of Sufism at the time. Qadizadeh Muhammad in Istanbul. He was a son of a judge, and he himself was assigned as a public preacher. And he became extremely critical of Sufis in Istanbul. At this time, Sufis were part of the establishment in Ottoman government. Like, these were the privileged people at the top. Sufis controlled jobs and the bureaucracy. And so a big part of the critique was the fact that they weren't necessarily very religious. There was a lot of corruption, and there's this facade of we're Sufis when really they're just controlling a lot of the government resources. That's a big part of it. But nonetheless, 18th century, you still had a strong presence of Sufis. So a lot of the Azhari teachers were aligned with the Khalwatiyya tariqa, which was supported by the Ottomans. So you had critiques, but still have a lot of power by the Sufis. Obviously, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab had his issues with Sufism. But it's important to point out that the whole beginning of quote-unquote Wahhabism was tied to a larger international phenomenon. It was like a one-off thing that came out of nowhere. Sometimes it's presented as that, like out of nowhere they come and start killing people. This was part of something that was going on globally. Of course, he did it in a much more violent way, but overall, it was part of a global phenomenon. And in India, Mujaddid Al-Fathani Ahmed Sirhindi, the founder of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Tariqa, he himself was very much a Sufi, but he was very critical of bid'ah. He's got his letters that have been compiled, and it's still not clear what his overall ideas were from these letters, but some of his letters are very telling. So he still believes in the idea that you can experience Allah through Sufi meditation, but he also says that he has no trust in any Sufi sayings or visions that go against the Sharia. He's very firm that no matter who the Sufi is or how much of an awliya you are, you can't say or do anything that contradicts the zahir of the Quran and Sunnah. He once himself had said certain things about experiencing God and having reached a level more than Abu Bakr, and then he apologized for it, and then you see a turn that clearly, like a lot of these Sufi sayings, even if they feel like this is true from their part, if it goes against the Quran and the Sunnah, it can't be considered, right? He reinterpreted Wahdat al-Wujud and termed it Wahdat al-Shuhud. That Wahdat al-Wujud, if people think that all creation is one, God and everything is one, this is a mistake. It's a lower level of Sufism, and that the point of the Sufi tariqah is not to get to wilaya, but to what he called the ubudiyya, that you sense that you're a servant of God. So he reinterpreted a lot of Sufi ideas, but nonetheless, he himself is a Sufi, and his tariqah actually spreads quite a bit through Mecca and to Istanbul. Yes?
There is a question about Wahdat al-Shuhud and Wahdat al-Wujud. Of course, it's the different.
Yes.
So he is not saying that Wahdat al-Wujud is Wahdat al-Shuhud.
No, he's
He's
not.
not saying that they are equal.
No.
Or that Ibn Arabi meant Wahdat al-Shuhud, not Wahdat al-Wujud. He's
Well,
not saying this.
yes, no. He's saying Wahdat al-Wujud is
It's
a
low level.
low level.
And we should have Wahdat al-Shuhud.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that the highest level, that the end of the Sufi path leads to this idea where everything seems connected to God.
Okay.
And the feeling is not of wilaya, where you feel connected to God. The feeling is of ubudiyya, that you realize, you experience that you're a slave, a servant of God, which is different than having knowledge, which you can get from the Quran, you're an abd, but you experience it emotionally, that you're God's servant. That's the point of the Sufi tariqah. So that's, and he called himself Mujaddid al-Fathani, the reviver of the second millennium. So, this was part of, how they talked. Yes. No, but Shawli al-Dihlawi was influenced by, Shawli al-Dihlawi was also part of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi and was part of this legacy. Yeah, so Shah Wali also contributed to that discussion a couple generations later. Yes.
Is there a development to the link between the fall of Baghdad and the decline that happened intellectually and the burning and the destruction of the books and the authority of the Khilafah, where waves of new Muslims, the Turks and the Mongols and others, they're coming into the deen while the Ummah has weakened all aspects. And maybe that's what Sufism found that a place, whether it's the influence from outside. Buddhism is definitely this Wahdat al-Wujud. As I think that's so. Is there a correlation in timing between the spread of Sufism in this form and its evolution and the weakness of the Khilafah?
Yeah, well, the Abbasi Khilafah, so there's a question about whether it's just a correlation between the weakness of the Khilafah and Sufism. So historically, the Abbasi Khilafah had become weakened by the 800s. So the Abbasid Khalifa, well, there was a civil war between Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun that really wreaked havoc on the Abbasid Empire. I mean, Harun al-Rashid had left a large legacy, a very powerful empire. And then upon his death, his two sons cut it up. And what ended up happening was a lot of areas had become pretty much independent. And then Al-Ma'mun takes over with the help of the Khurasani leaders and troops. And then his younger brother, Al-Mu'tasim, starts importing Turkish slaves, which end up taking over Baghdad and Samarra. And so by that time, by the middle 800s, you don't really have a strong Abbasi Khilafah. You have independent dynasties that might pay lip service, but don't really respect the Khalifa. Within Baghdad and in Samarra, it's always internal violence. The Turkish slaves are rebelling. They want their money. They're not getting paid. There is no money. There's a lot of embezzlement and corruption. You have to embezzle money because when the next Khalifa is put in place, if you don't have enough money to pay, you'll get put to death. So there's a lot of embezzlement and corruption. So by the 800s, you don't really have a strong Khalifa. But whether that, so in that sense, if the point of reference is one strong political empire, then there was a political decline. But this is also the period when you get 875 is when, like I said, Imam Bukhari dies, and after him the whole Sahih movement. So a lot of free movement going on where muhaddithin are collecting hadith. You get development of fiqh really after this. You get a lot of more, whereas Baghdad was the main center, when power becomes more decentralized, you get multiple different centers of intellectual activity and cultural activity. You get, so there's, it's much more complicated than just decline, because there was so much going on. And of course you get a lot more conversion happening. So between 900 and 1100 is when most of Iran, Iraq converts, becomes Muslim. Most of Khorasan becomes Muslim. Most of North Africa becomes Muslim. So from that point, if it's not decline because you have so much more Muslims coming in, you have, because of that, more scholarship as well. So it's not necessarily just decline.
It should be noted that this change in 4, 5, 6, 700 years.
Yeah.
Very organic. No one factor can be said this is what they. I think like the sunrise occurs, it takes time till it's noon. So Sufism came right after the Prophet died. 200 years when we encountered life, this ummah started to encounter this phenomenon to be built as Fakra. Today,
Right.
I don't think you can read a book today that was not written by some Sufi or. But the purest of the purest will have to take it from this. Because there wasn't any.
Right, exactly. So I mean, it really becomes a part of mainstream like Sunni Islam at that time for a variety of reasons. I mean, a lot of scholars who were important teachers of fiqh and people who were in charge of teaching in madrasas had an inclination towards Sufism. And, they were much more of a fiqh-oriented Sufism, like Al-Qushayri were very critical of just singing and other aspects that were going on. But nonetheless, that paved the way for others to claim that because I'm a Sufi, this is fine, right? Because once the tradition becomes normal, then by association, you can normalize what you're doing. So that was a part of it. And then, like things like vernacularization, more people are familiar with Sufi teachings. Most people are not familiar with fiqh or aqidah. Everybody knew the poems of Rumi, for example, not necessarily in the Quran. So
that's
The explanation.
yeah. So I'm gonna end it here because the modern period, it's too much to talk about. So this is by the 1800s. This is the layout of the land between the Sufis and the empires.
I've seen like some advantage. I mean, they have a lot of influence upon Muslims, like seems like Sufism. But can I say they have some advantage and disadvantage upon Islam?
Well, yeah. So the question about disadvantage and disadvantage of Sufism. Well, there were clearly advantages, which is why it attracted people. Like advantages being one. Initially, there was this focus on the interior aspect of piety. So a lot of the Sufis, like Abdul Qadir Jilani, is very critical of people who claim to be ulama, but they only want to get positions as teachers or bureaucrats, and not for knowledge and for piety. So there was a big emphasis within Sufism, especially with the Seljuks, when you get the establishment of things like Nizamiya Madrasa, and then you get more and more Sufi ulama become bureaucrats and part of governments. Becoming an alim meant getting a job as a judge, as a clerk, as a tax collector, as a bureaucrat. There was more criticisms amongst more Sufi inclined jurists and ulama that the purpose of ilm is not to get a job, is to, you know, for one's own relationship with Allah. So there were those type of critiques. And there was also the fact that a lot of people only had access to Sufis, and especially women. So we learned a lot about social history amongst the peasant and the women from reading Sufi histories. Average men and especially average women are completely absent in the major books of history written by ulama. You only hear about the concerns of peasants or of women because they come to the Sufis and they complain about things. And the students of the Sufis write down the sayings of the Sufi saints and the people coming to them and asking them. So we learn so much about the day-to-day concerns of average Joe Schmo, Ahmad, Aisha, whatever. So they were there. People had access to them. You didn't have access to the alim. Maybe he was the judge. You have to go to the city or something. So there were, you know, those type of advantages.
And there's certain things we have to emphasize on being aware of the sort of certain elements, certain things that we have to emphasize, or this is not un-Islamic, which is.
Yeah, so what's Islamic and un-Islamic, that's beyond the scope of my talk, because you know, I purposely restricted to history rather than going into Islamic, un-Islamic. We've had discussions about that. You know, Vlade covered Sufism in a number of his classes, so we do have resources for that. Go ahead, yeah.
Just make maybe final remark, please.
Yes, please.
Okay, Barakallah feek, and first of all, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. But there are certain points maybe they need further discussion and research. One is the origin of Sufism. This needs also by any one of us, or you, or anyone else. And this subject, until now, it's not settled. Like
no,
you said,
it's not.
some Western academia, even they talk about the word Sufi is taken from word Sufis, which is Greek word.
Right?
It's a Greek group. That's one point I would say we need to. There is, I think they said that the first Sufi appeared in the year 150 of Hijrah. That's what I read. A person was in certain areas. That's also maybe needs to be verified regarding the history of Sufism. And the other point is the evidences for some area influence doesn't have to be objective evidence. It can be. And when we go to Bilad Sham, we see the effect of the Greek astrologism and Greek philosophy appeared in the Mutakallimin. And you have after that Al-Ma'mun established Dar al-Hikmah for the translation, which started even earlier at the end of the Umayyads. And you see some ideas of Sufism really match with Hinduism, Buddhism, and even Greek philosophy. When you see the Sufis use the word Al-Arif Billah, which is translated to be Gnostic. And in Arabic, they use Al-Ghanusiyyah, openly. They don't deny this. When you see, I was reading on Al-Haqqani website about the life of Ibn Arabi. They said in Arabic, that's in Arabic, I can send it to you. They said that he used to go to a secret school teaching some philosophies. And from there, they said he got the knowledge mubasharatan from the pearls of the Hikmah, Pythagoras and other Greeks who died centuries ago. He took from them directly in that secret school. So these things can't be overlooked, and it tells us something. The other point I would say, maybe if we can identify two patterns of Sufism. The intellectual Sufis, the ideological Sufis, and the ritual Sufis. Those who just have dhikr maybe in bid'ah, but versus those who carried certain notions like Ibn Arabi, like Hallaj, and Hulul, and Al-Ittihad, and Wahdat al-Wujud. That's another point. The third point I would say maybe the effect of Sheikh Sarruq is to be also focused on. His impact on Sufism.
Yeah, it's important. It's a book about his life.
I wish that Sufis follow that. And when he says that, I just want to mention 3 points. he said that الصوفي الفقيه الفقيه الصوفي أفضل من الصوفي الفقيه. And الفقيه المتصوف أفضل من الصوفي الفقيه. The faqih with mindset who happen to be a Sufi is much better than the Sufi who has the Sufi mindset and became faqih. And then he talks about the fiqh is needed. Sufism is not needed. You have the fiqh, you don't need Sufi. So the impact of this, the impact of Al-Ghazali also. I was reading once that they say Al-Ghazali, Sufism before Al-Ghazali is different than Sufism after Al-Ghazali. So maybe this point needs to be studied furthermore. What role did Al-Ghazali play in splitting Sufism? They said he is the one who introduced Sufism to Arabs. For that,
No.
some people say this. So these things are maybe needed. I'm not talking now about, like you said there, it's not just not about theological Sufism, it's just to understand the history of this phenomenon. Barakallah.
Sure. Go ahead.
You mentioned Islam and then you say spread.
Sorry, what?
Islam spread
Yeah.
to Iraq and then you say to North Africa. Very small North Africa, East Africa. And then the Islam spread from East Africa to the rest of the Arab, not from. Yeah, it may start with.
Sorry, I don't understand what. Can you repeat your question again? I'm sorry.
No, you said Islam spread from. It spread to Iraq.
Yeah.
And then the other Arab Middle East, and then say to North Africa.
Yes.
It's not North Africa.
It's
I'm trying to make a mistake.
okay. So you're saying Islam didn't spread to North Africa? It spread to East Africa.
East Africa. And then beside Islam, it may commence or start in Hijaz. It starts there. But it starts there, but spread from East Africa. Spread from there.
I don't understand the point.
Yeah.
What you don't understand the point? It's very clearly.
So can you end this and I'll
No,
stop it?
he was saying,
Okay.
yeah, from Africa, when spirit came from Africa, after the Hijrah. There was no Hijrah in Yemen or Hijrah in other Africa. The
Okay,
Hijrah
so-
wasn't in Habasha. They're from Habasha.
Okay. I mean, I'm not African history is not that familiar. So
I'm trying to make it straight.
so yes, the brother's saying that Islam spread from East Africa and then from there to other parts of Africa.
Yeah, from North Africa, even to Arab. Came from. It's even to the Arab countries. It's spread from there.
So it spread from East Africa to the other Arab countries.
I have a comment. Comment is what I've read and heard. Where Sufi comes from. So, because back then when people were trading grains and other stuff, it used to come in these mats or these sacks. And these sacks are made of a very abrasive, low quality cloth. The earlier Sufis, in order to deny themselves worldly pleasures, instead of wearing nice, softer clothes, they used to make their clothes from the material of the sack, or silk. That's why it is called Sufi. That's just one observation. And then, the observation that I have is talking about current times. I've seen big organized push in North America, especially the West Coast and the Midwest, back to the Sufis. You'll see a lot of Sufi masajid, a lot of Sufi madrasas actually opening everywhere, especially on the East Coast, the Midwest. I don't know much about the West Coast because I'm kind of new here. But I've seen this is kind of coming in a very organized way where there are these groups coming from Central Asia, from Turkey, India, from Syria. They actually have a lot of money and they're establishing these Sufi institutions right here in the West. It kind of looks very organized. It wasn't happening 10 years ago. It was just a very recent.
Yeah, so 2 points about the origins of the word Sufi. Scholars debate the origin of the word. A part of an important aspect of history is that origins are not determinative. So there's a lot of debate over how Sufism started and where it came from. But I think what's clear is that it became very much a part of the broader Muslim tradition. You had muhaddithin and fuqaha bringing their training, commenting upon whatever they inherited. So it very much might be the case that Sufism began from either Christianity or Buddhism. You know, they each had a presence in Iraq for sure. But it won't be determinative of the entire tradition historically. So the question of origins is not, doesn't determine the entire history. Because one thing about tradition is that it's always changing. And it's very good at masking that it's changed, but it's part of history. The discipline of history itself studies change. So by me saying a historical approach, I'm automatically saying it changed. Now, even if it didn't change, you know, people will study Islam historically and will find changes perhaps where there not have been. That's just the discipline of history.
Those who say that it is traditional, they get it back to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
But by saying traditional, it doesn't necessarily mean.
Not you.
It doesn't.
Those who the Sufis.
Yes, but
They bring it back to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
but that's one of the things about when you study historically, you see that fine, it's traditional. That doesn't mean it's organically connected. Traditions are created by humans in history, and what we try to do is uncover that process of how it was created, by whom, through what ways, just like every other human tradition. And then I don't remember the second aspect. Modern day Sufi institutions. There's a lot going on with the politics of Sufism, its connections with UAE and there. I don't have too much to say about that at this point in time. But there's definitely, you know, a lot going on in terms of funding for what's considered Sufis worldwide. So I'll end it with that. Thank you very much.